Okay, so we're diving deep today into a topic that I gotta say kind of creeps me out, but also like totally fascinates me at the same time.
I get it. It's one of those subjects that's hard to look away from, even if it makes you a little uncomfortable.
Exactly. Serial killer movies. I put together this list of 10 films that really get into that world. But I think what I'm most curious about is why these stories have such a hold on us. Like, what is it about these dark, often disturbing narratives that draws us in?
That's a great question. And I think one of the first things that jumps out from the list you've compiled is how diverse these films actually are. We're not just talking about straight up horror here. You've got psychological thrillers, dark comedies, satires, even a faux documentary in there. It's a really fascinating mix of approaches to a pretty unsettling subject.
Right. And I think that's part of what makes this whole thing so interesting to explore. It's not just about the thrill of the chase or the gore, although those elements are certainly there in some of these films. It's more about what these stories reveal about us, about the dark side of human nature, about the anxieties we have as individuals and as a society. So where should we start?
Well, I think a good place to begin is with a film that often tops these kinds of lists. Sus 7 is from 1995, directed by David Fincher, and it really sets a bleak and nightmarish tone that I think a lot of people associate with this genre.
A second, yeah. I mean, visually, it's just so oppressive. The constant rain, the grimy, nameless city, it all creates this sense of inescapable dread.
Absolutely. And it's not just the setting. The crimes themselves are horrific, meticulously staged around the seven deadly sins. The killer, John Doe, is like this embodiment of pure evil, but he's also got this twisted sense of purpose, using these murders as these gruesome morality lessons.
Right. And then you have the two detectives, Somerset and Mills, played by Morgan Freeman and Brad Pitt, trying to make sense of it all. It's almost like they're being pulled into this abyss, this world of darkness, and it takes a toll on them.
That's a key element here. The film isn't just about catching a killer. It's about the psychological cost of confronting evil, the way it can eat away at you. And that ending, with Somerset's disillusioned words about the world being a fine place but not worth fighting for, it leaves you with this feeling of utter hopelessness.
Totally. Okay, so moving on to our number 2 pick, we have The Silence of the Lambs. This one came out a few years earlier in 1991, and it takes a slightly different approach, but it's still so intensely psychological.
Yeah, The Silence of the Lambs really hinges on the dynamic between Clarice Starling, this young FBI trainee, and Hannibal Lecter, the brilliant but terrifying cannibalistic psychiatrist. It's a battle of wits, but it's also about Starling having to confront her own fears and vulnerabilities to get what she needs from Lecter.
And Lecter, even though he's locked up, he holds all the cards. He's manipulating her, playing these mind games, but he's also giving her clues about Buffalo Bill, the serial killer she's trying to catch. Anthony Hopkins' performance as Lecter is just chilling, so subtle and controlled, you can feel the menace underneath.
It's a masterclass in acting, for sure. And the film really gets under your skin, exploring that idea that to understand true darkness, you sometimes have to get dangerously close to it. It's worth noting that this film actually swept the top 5 categories at the Oscars, which is incredibly rare for a genre film, especially one that's so unsettling.
That's right. It won Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Adapted Screenplay.
Yeah.
Pretty impressive. Okay, so for number 3, we have to go back a few decades to Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho from 1960. This film is often credited with changing the game for horror movies.
Absolutely. Psycho is a masterclass in suspense and unexpected twists. What's brilliant about it is the way it sets you up thinking it's one kind of movie and then completely pulls the rug out from under you. You think you're watching a crime thriller about Marion Crane on the run, and then suddenly you're at the Bates Motel with Norman Bates, and everything changes.
Yeah, that shower scene is one for the books. It was so shocking at the time, and it still holds up as one of the most iconic moments in horror cinema.
It's not just the violence itself, though. It's the way Hitchcock builds the tension, the use of stark black and white cinematography, the quick cuts and jarring angles in the editing, and that screeching score by Brainerd Herman. It all comes together to create this overwhelming sense of panic and terror.
And Anthony Perkins as Norman Bates, he's just unforgettable. That awkward charm masking something much darker and more disturbed underneath. So ahead of its time in terms of how it portrayed mental illness on screen.
Definitely. And it's interesting how Hitchcock managed to get away with so much given the strict censorship rules of the time. He had to be clever about it, using suggestion and implication rather than showing things directly, which actually makes it even more effective, I think.
For sure. All right, let's move on to number 4, which is another early classic, Fritz Lang's M from 1931. This one really set the stage for many of the conventions we see in serial killer films today.
Yeah. M is considered a landmark film for a reason. It focuses on Hans Becker, a child murderer, and the fear that he instills in an entire city. What's groundbreaking is how Lang shows us both sides of the story, the police investigation and the killer's perspective. We see how Beckett is tormented by his own compulsions even as he commits these horrific acts.
And Peter Lorre's performance as Beckett is incredible. You can really feel the character's inner struggle, the way he's both repulsed by and drawn to his dark desire.
Lang was a master of visual storytelling. The way he uses shadows and silence to create suspense, the intercutting between different storylines, it's all so effective. And the film also raises some really big questions about justice, mob rule, and the responsibility of society to protect its most vulnerable members.
Okay, let's jump ahead a few decades now to Bong Joon-ho's Memories of Murder. This one is from 2003, and it's based on South Korea's first documented serial murder case.
Memories of Murder is a really fascinating film because it offers such a different perspective on police work than we often see in Hollywood films. The detectives in this film, Park Do-man and Seo Tae-yoon, are far from perfect. They're flawed, they make mistakes, they get frustrated, and they sometimes resort to brutality.
It feels much more realistic, right? It's messy and chaotic, and there's a constant sense of desperation as they try to catch the killer, who always seems to be one step ahead.
Exactly. It's a deliberate subversion of those classic procedural tropes where the brilliant detective always solves the case with logic and deduction. And beyond the crime itself, the film also acts as a commentary on the political and social climate of South Korea in the 1980s, a time of great upheaval and uncertainty.
Right. Okay, for number 6, we're back to David Fincher with Zodiac. This one is from 2007, and it focuses on the real-life case of the Zodiac killer, which, as you know, was never officially solved.
Yeah, Zodiac is a different kind of serial killer film because it's not about the satisfaction of seeing the killer brought to justice. It's about the obsession, the frustration, the toll that an unsolved case takes on those who are determined to crack it. You have Robert Graysmith, the cartoonist turned amateur sleuth, Paul Avery, the crime reporter, and Dave Toschi, the lead detective, and they all become consumed by this case.
The film does a great job of capturing that feeling of paranoia, the sense that the killer could be anyone, anywhere. And the way Fincher uses archival footage and meticulous recreations of real events, it gives the whole thing this eerie authenticity.
It's a slow burn, for sure, but it's so compelling. And it raises some interesting questions about the nature of obsession, the allure of the unknown, and the power of these kinds of unsolved mysteries to capture our imagination.
All right, at number 7, we have a film that takes a much more satirical approach to the genre, American Psycho, from 2000.
American Psycho is a wild ride. It's set in the 1980s, and it follows Patrick Bateman, this Wall Street nuppie who also happens to be a serial killer. The film is full of graphic violence, but it's also a sharp critique of consumerism, greed, and the shallowness of that era.
Christian Bale is phenomenal as Patrick Bateman. He's got this perfect blend of charisma and menace, and you can never quite tell what's real and what's going on in his head.
Right. It's this brilliant satire of that whole Wall Street culture, the obsession with status symbols, the casual cruelty, and the sense that these guys are so disconnected from reality that they can get away with anything.
Okay, for number 8, we have a film that's truly disturbing, but also incredibly clever. Man Bites Dog, from 1992. This is the one I mentioned earlier that's shot as a faux documentary.
Man Bites Dog is not for the faint of heart. It follows a film crew as they document the life of Ben, a charismatic but utterly ruthless serial killer. What makes it so unsettling is the way the filmmakers gradually become complicit in Ben's crimes, blurring the lines between observer and participant.
It's a really dark and twisted film, but it's also a brilliant commentary on our fascination with violence and the ethics of filmmaking. The black and white aesthetic and the handheld camera work give it this gritty, almost voyeuristic feel.
It's a film that definitely makes you question your own role as a viewer, your own complicity in consuming this kind of content. It's not easy to watch, but it's definitely thought-provoking.
All right, let's lighten things up a bit for number 9 with a classic dark comedy, Arsenic and Old Lace, from 1944.
Arsenic and Old Lace. It's a delightful example of how a film about serial killers can actually be hilarious. It's about two sweet old aunts who poison lonely old men with elderberry wine, believing they're doing them a favor.
And then you have their nephew, Mortimer, who's a drama critic, and the only seemingly normal one in the family, trying to keep everything under wraps. Cary Grant is so funny in this role, all flustered and exasperated as the chaos unfolds around him.
It's a classic farce, full of mistaken identities, slapstick humor, and witty dialogue. It's a reminder that even within this dark subject matter, there's room for laughter and absurdity.
And finally, at number 10, we have Michael Powell's Peeping Tom from 1960. This one was highly controversial upon its release, but it's now considered a masterpiece of psychological horror.
Peeping Tom is a fascinating but deeply disturbing film about voyeurism and the nature of fear. It follows Mark Lewis, a cameraman who films women as he murders them, capturing their expressions of terror. The film explores the roots of his compulsion, which stem from childhood trauma inflicted by his own father.
It's a really unsettling film, but it's also visually stunning and incredibly well acted. It makes you think about the power of the gaze, the way the camera can be used to both capture and exploit vulnerability.
It's a film that really pushes the boundaries, and it's interesting how its reputation has changed over time. What was once considered exploitative and distasteful is now seen as a groundbreaking exploration of the darker side of human psychology.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from the bleak nihilism of Cézanne to the darkly comedic absurdity of arsenic and old lace. It's amazing to see how filmmakers have tackled this subject in so many different ways.
And I think that's part of what makes this genre so enduringly fascinating. It allows us to explore the extremes of human behavior, to confront our fears and anxieties, and to grapple with big questions about morality, justice, and the nature of evil itself.
It's not just about the thrills and chills. These films can really make you think about the world around you, about the darkness that exists within us all, and about the choices we make when faced with it.
Exactly. So the next time you find yourself drawn to a serial killer movie, ask yourself why. What is it about these stories that speaks to you? What anxieties or fascinations are they tapping into? I think you might be surprised by what you discover.
That's a great takeaway. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It's been, well, let's just say eliminating.
Absolutely. And a little bit unsettling, which I think is part of the point, right?
You got that right.